Good evening, everyone. To introduce myself, I am Professor Gareth Fisher, President of the Royal Scottish Academy, and I'd like to welcome you to the 10th Metzstein Architecture Discourse, which this year is presented by Peter Barber of Peter Barber Architects. Welcome, Peter. For those unfamiliar with the concept of this event, the original idea for the discourse came from Richard Murphy, RSA, sitting here on my left-hand side, and was inaugurated by the Academy to honour one of our prominent academicians, Professor Izzy Metzstein. A remarkable architect, teacher, and former treasurer of the RSA, Izzy, under the umbrella of the Glasgow practice of Gillespie, Kidd and Coyer, worked alongside Andy Macmillan, RSA, to produce some of the most remarkable and distinguished modern architecture in post-war Britain. His wit, intelligence, and insight is still very much missed in the Academy, and I would like to make a special welcome to his wife Danny and daughter Ruth, who join us here tonight. We thank them for their continued support of this discourse. Before we begin the lecture, I would like to take a moment to thank all of the people who have helped to make this event happen. Firstly, Rab Bennett, who's just spoken to you, RSA, the architect responsible for the remodelling of the building in which we sit, and also Richard Murphy, RSA, for their tireless work in bringing the discourse to fruition. Not only have they given significant amount of time from their professional and personal lives, but their patience, guidance and wisdom throughout the planning of the event has assisted to drive this particular project forward. Thanks also go to Callum Dalgetty for his excellent work on the publication, which charts the history of Peter Barber Architects and can be purchased after the discourse for the very modest sum of £10. And a very special thank you to Matt Hill and Colin Greenslade from the RSA for their hard work in pulling together the organisation of this event. And final thanks go to Jim MacDonald of Architecture and Design Scotland, whose financial support for this event has been much appreciated by the Academy. I would like to welcome Jim to the stage to say a few words, and in the meantime, I thank you all for attending the 10th Royal Scottish Academy Metzstein Architecture Discourse. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And if my family are listening, it's not my money, it's Architecture and Design Scotland's money that provided the sponsorship. Hello everybody. Yes, I'm Jim MacDonald, Chief Executive at Architecture and Design Scotland. For those who don't know the organisation, we are Scotland's national champion for design in the built environment. And we're delighted to be sponsoring tonight's event. I'm also able to welcome you to our new office. We moved in here last summer and we're finding the building very much to our liking. So thanks to Rab and the team for that. I think it's particularly appropriate that we're sponsoring tonight's event in our new home, because we will also be taking an increased focus in the future on all things housing, responding to the housing crisis that we are currently in. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from Peter and possibly even speaking to him later on to pick his brains about a few things. And I would also look forward to hosting and being involved in more events like this in our wonderful new home. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Richard and wish you all well for the rest of the evening and hope to speak to some of you before the night is out. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening. I won't speak very long because I know you want to hear from Peter. But just to say, a discourse is about ideas, and you'll get a lot of ideas from Peter as well as his architecture. We have a great tradition of creating memorable urban spaces in this country. There's one just about half a mile away from here, further north. But as we all know, something went wrong in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And the young Peter Barber read the book by Jane Jacobs, The Life and Death of the Great American City, and was greatly moved. I'm sure you're very familiar with that book. The curiosity about Peter is he's both a modernist in terms of his architecture, Not a pitched roof anywhere, by the way. But he's also quite a conservative in his urban design. He talks in terms of typologies that are tried and trusted. The townhouse, the terrace, the mews lane, the almshouse, the courtyard, even that bête noire of urban clearance schemes, the back-to-back. He has no need for typological invention. Touring his projects in London, which I had a couple of very exciting weekends doing, I was amazed at how he manages to create extraordinary buildings and extraordinary spaces from the most unlikely contexts. A grass verge, a central reservation of a road, and perhaps the most heroic of all, the edge of a motorway, which is the North Circular Road. Extraordinary invention to create these spaces as an example to us all of how we can densify cities and make urban places once again. One can't help feeling that if such an approach happened in Scotland or in Edinburgh, we'd have no need for further expansion into greenfield sites. Politics. You can't discuss Peter's housing without his politics, and he's an unrelenting and proud left-winger, as you might imagine, and his commitment to contributing to the problems of homelessness is quite remarkable in terms of a number of highly intelligent projects in London. But it's not just the left who admire Peter, the right do as well, can you believe that? And he attracts intelligent developers who understand that he brings value to the most unlikely sites and creates value by creating urban spaces. Some time ago, a Metzstein Discourse by the name of Sir David Chipperfield was here, and he made a rather good joke, I thought, but it was a serious joke. And he said, having established a lot of buildings in Germany, that he noticed the difference between the German planning system and the British planning system was that in Germany, planners plan. Here, they don't do that, and they don't even call it planning anymore. They call it development control, and then he added, a bit like pest control. Something is going wrong with our planning. We can see it if you tour Edinburgh with the multiplication of brown brick, 4-story blocks of nothingness that are all around the periphery of this city and are creating no urban spaces whatsoever. Extraordinary for a city that gave us the new town. And don't get me started on suburbia, how towns like Haddington and South Queensferry are being surrounded by the worst tacky suburban housing you've ever seen. I would venture to suggest that housing and urban design is at a nadir. Jim's got his work cut out. And finally, I want to issue you a warning. Having met Peter several times, he gives us hope. His optimism is infectious. Peter.
Is that switched off now, that one? Ah, good. Right. Hello. It's brilliant to be back in Edinburgh, and especially on a day like this. We came up last night and have had the most brilliant day. I said to Richard, I felt like a kid in a sweet shop, walking around this amazing city, looking up. Daisy, my partner, and I, and so it's so amazing to see it in the sunshine. I'm really, thank you so much for inviting me up, and I'm really flattered to have had so much interest from Richard in going around and seeing our projects in London and writing and producing this lovely book. So I will talk, as you could imagine, about some of our projects, our built projects, and I will go on to talk about some of my drawing projects, because I like to dream a little as well, as an escape from the day-to-day of architectural practice. But before I get into directly into the architecture, I want to talk a little bit about the context in which I work, and I suspect there are parallels in Scotland. I don't know, and you'll have to form your own opinions. But so a little bit about the context in which we're struggling to do what we do,
a little bit about some of the ideas which are our sort of moral compass, which lie at the roots of what we try to do, which kind of help us to make design decisions. And so I'll give you some quotes and some images which I find inspiring to get there. But we start off with an image of a march that we went on, I suppose it was 7 years ago now, which reminds me to share with you the sort of dismay really that comes with a succession of housing bills and housing policy from governments of both persuasions, which have seen the destruction of the incredible sort of the thing that we inherited from the post-war generation, which was the extraordinary production of social housing at the rate of about 150,000 a year, so that by the late 70s, nearly half the population of our countries enjoyed the benefits of living in social housing. And clearly, one after another, bits of policy have been introduced since 1977. I mean, incidentally, they were building a national health service at the same time, weren't they? The country was broke, and they still managed to do this incredible thing and build a health service. So if they could do it then, we could do it now, and I think we just have to hold on to that thought. This is a very, not an unfamiliar sight for us in and around London, and it's neatly captioned by a quote from David Cameron, who said this: "Post-war estates across the country are ripe for redevelopment. We will sweep away the planning blockages and take new steps to reduce political and reputational risk for projects' key decision makers." That's sinister, isn't it? And investors. "I believe that together we can tear down anything that stands in our way." And tear it down they have, and I dare say this is not an unfamiliar sight for you as well. And in its place, and in other places which could well be developed for social housing, we have this kind of thing. This is South London, it's Battersea. And this is sort of global capitalism descending on a site in central London and making of it what it will. Sort of just capital in its most abstract form, sort of swirling around, smashing buildings down, throwing up other buildings. And this is housing seen as investment vehicle, as commodity, and not as basic infrastructure. And I think this lies at the heart of the crisis which we're facing at the moment in London, presumably one of the richest cities the world has ever known. There are currently 170,000 homeless people either living on the streets, there are nearly 10,000 of them, but also people living in kind of temporary accommodation and in hostels. So it's a shameful situation, and as I say, if the post-war generation were able to deal with this, then surely we, a much wealthier country now, ought to be able to do the same. So this is again a familiar sight for us, not far from Apsley House and Buckingham Palace. A poor soul living in a subway. This is a photograph taken by a homeless person. A friend of mine working with a homeless charity and with homeless people gave disposable cameras to people to take pictures of their own environment. So this is one person's bedroom. And this is another person's bedroom. This is in just close to Hyde Park. And this one-bedroom flat, it went for 15 million quid. So we have a problem, don't we, really, essentially of inequality. And it's very neatly illustrated by those two images. So there's a housing crisis, major housing crisis, but we know, don't we, that there are about 400,000 or 500,000 or 600,000 empty homes in the UK. Many of those, I mean, for instance, in London, there are 30,000 empty homes, which are people have bought an investment property, it's just sitting there, accruing value. They don't want to be doing anything with it. Perhaps an overseas investor, they've perhaps never seen it. But a lot of the other ones are in parts of our countries where populations have left, where the lack of any work has meant that places have become depopulated. So these are familiar sites in those locations. And so it seems to me this is part of the problem, and I'll come back to that when I describe one of the projects towards the end of this talk, which seeks to think about that issue. You know, 500,000 empty homes. in a country where there are probably, I don't know what the figure is, but probably not that many more homeless people. This brings me to a more architectural moment in the talk, and it's an image of the city of Naples, where you're going on Saturday, I think, perhaps. A little aside there. It is a quote, really, that goes with this image from a great hero of mine, Walter Benjamin. And in 1924, he wrote a book called One Way Street, in which he describes, in each of the chapters, a European city. And the one that captures my imagination is his description of Naples. And in it, he talks about the relationship between people and architecture, between culture and space. And he talks about architecture as being really inert and uninteresting and nothing until it has life breathed into it by the people who move into it and create the kind of colourful street scene that is happening here. And so he's championing an architecture which is permeable, which invites occupation, and as I say, which erupts into life when people start to use it. And when we are designing our projects and confronted by an empty sheet of paper or a site plan, it's starting to think about how people are occupying the spaces that we are creating, which really fires up our imagination. Excuse me. Right, so this is Walter Benjamin. He says this. So he's describing this scene or something like it. The passion for improvisation demands that space and opportunity be at any price preserved. Buildings are used as a popular stage. They're all divided into innumerable, simultaneously animated theatres: balcony, courtyard, window, gateway, staircase, roof, are at the same time stages and boxes. So he's conceiving as the city as a sort of theatre where we're both performers but also observers. As porous as the stone is the architecture. Buildings and action interpenetrate in the courtyards, arcades and staircases and stairways. In everything they preserve the scope to become a theatre of new unforeseen constellations. The stamp of the definitive is avoided. No situation appears intended forever. And so I find this a lovely way of thinking about architecture, and it gets beyond the idea of thinking about architecture as object and into the idea of thinking of it as a kind of living, breathing organism which really only matters insofar as it serves people. So this is just a street, isn't it? So this is a street in Brighton, which I'm very familiar with, and it just reminds me to talk a little bit about the cities. When we think of a city like London or Brighton, and probably the same for Edinburgh, 70% of all of the buildings in these cities are houses or housing. So the city is made of houses and housing. When we design houses in an urban context, we're designing the city. The housing is what sort of brings people into close proximity. It compresses public space into narrow streets. It surrounds our squares. I don't need to tell you this. The evidence is all around us. But in a way, it's good as architects to be reminded of that when we're working on urban housing projects. There are lots of lessons to be learned from a street like this. I mean, not every street is like this, but there are lots of lessons to be learned from a street like this. It's a place which has a life 24 hours a day because there are people living on it, there are people shopping on it, there's a pub on the corner. It brings lots of different sorts of people into close proximity: old people, young people, different people from different socio-economic groups, different racial groups. And so it performs this incredible a whole series of things that it does for us. It's an easy way of finding our way around the city. It feels safe. You know, Jane Jacobs, Richard mentioned, she talked about eyes on the street. The idea is that people are looking down on you and you never feel as though you're alone. And so, you know, this is another key part of the thinking of that we sort of bring to our work when we're designing our projects. Very often, it's always street-based housing, but very often we're introducing a new street or a new square as a gift back to the city in addition to creating the housing itself. This is an image of a space at the edge of the city of Marrakesh, and I find it really instructive again because it helps us to think about public space. And public space is the strangest of things, isn't it? It belongs to kind of everybody, but it belongs to nobody either. And what's happened here in this space in Marrakesh for the last 1,000 years is that in the cool of the evening, the teeming alleyways of the city sort of discharge into this space. And the most fantastic, Walter Benjamin would have loved it, the most fantastic sort of theatrical scene kind of plays out. There are very few sort of monuments here. This is about the people. This is about little temporary pieces of architecture being pulled out to create a stage, a ring of people creating another kind of architecture surrounding perhaps a snake charmer or a musician. And it's kind of as ephemeral as architecture can be, but it's absolutely real. And the name of this space is Jama al-Fana, which one of the translations of which is a mosque of nothing. And I love the idea of public space being a mosque of nothing. In other words, a space where people can express themselves relatively freely and kind of bring their personality to the space and interact with their neighbors and people they don't know and tourists and all sorts of people. And you know, that is what public space is or can be. And that reading of the space, the Mosque of Nothing, and the freedom that it brings is reinforced by the fact that behind the photographer in this picture is the Grand Mosque of Marrakesh with its 3-meter thick walls kind of exemplifying or symbolizing a kind of unchanging and rather fixed ideology, but both sort of in terms of its architecture, but its counterpoint in the extraordinary scene that plays out in a slightly different way each night. So again, something that a kind of sensibility which we try to bring to our work, and the importance that we attract, that we attach to public space in our projects. We'll say a couple of words about our office and how we work, and I want to caption this picture, which is obviously where we are, with a quote from another of my heroes, who's called Lina Bobardi, who's a wonderful South American architect with strong views. And there's a lovely book about her work called Stones Against Diamonds. But she talks here about the responsibility that comes with having a shop front, as we do. She says this: "The city is a public space, a great exhibition offering all kinds of subtle readings, and anyone who has a shop, a window display, or any showcase of this kind has to assume a moral responsibility which requires that their window display might help to shape the face of the city and reveal something of its essence." And so our models sit in the window. We have a little display which is also a sort of changing display which shares with people what we're up to. This is the interior office, which Richard now knows quite well. And this reveals, of course, that we work a great deal with models. For many architects, the model is slightly a thing of the past, and the computer model is a thing. But we're not like that. We think that we're very analog and old-fashioned in that sense. And we think if you can make a physical model, and we make them ourselves with scalpels, we don't do it. We don't give it to a computer to do. It can become a sort of design, as well as being a demonstration tool, a presentation tool. It's something that we can use to actually design our project. So we do draw, and we work with models, and we move rapidly in quite a dynamic process between the two. But sometimes we have lunch on the roof as well. And there's the team. So I'm an inveterate sketcher, and I have sketchbooks, but when it comes to the projects themselves, I also overlay sheets of this yellow sort of tracing paper, and in a sort of an additive or an iterative process, kind of build up layers, layer upon layer, the changing design as it develops. It's quite fun sometimes to go back through where you started and where you get to. So here are some examples and working three-dimensionally a great deal as well. And then, so the very large-scale models. This is a model we made of Greenwich Millennium Village, which we were involved with at the early stage. These are foam models at quite small scale, where we can see urban form, we can see massing, we can see the width of streets and understand whether buildings are too close together or whether they feel about right. And then we go up a scale, where we're starting to look at fenestration and in more detail at the public spaces that we're creating. And upper scale again, where we can start to look at interiors. So that model in reality is probably, that big. So this is the first of the built projects I'm going to show you. It's called Donnybrook, and we basically cut our teeth on this project. It's 50 or so homes. It was a competition run by the Architecture Foundation in London. 100 or so, more than 100 practices went in for it, and we hit the jackpot with it, which we had no right to do because there was only 2 of us in the office. And we didn't really know what we were doing, but sometimes that's quite an advantage, you know, a bit of you do things which you wouldn't perhaps do if you were a bit more jaded. And so this is a project which has got 50 or so homes in it. You can see if we can get this pointer working. No, not that one. Oh, what have I done? Help! Could somebody help? Oh, there we go. So that's it there, look. So look, there are 2, you know, I was talking about streets, right? So this competition, I think, was asking for a fence around the site and an apartment building in the middle of it. Well, we inverted it, and we said on our competition boards, because you always need a strap line, this scheme is a celebration of the public social life of the street. They didn't ask for streets in the competition, but it captured the imagination of, I think, of the judges. So there are 2 streets, and it widens out a little square in between the buildings. So this is a reinterpretation of a type that's quite common in London and also elsewhere, where one flat with the front door there sits below a maisonette which sits up above. They all have front doors along the street. So although these are apartment buildings, there's virtually no common area circulation here. Everybody has their front door on the street. So you see your neighbour in the street rather than a corridor or a lift or on a deck. And it seems to me that that is a better place to get to know people who you live with and around. That gateway leads into that 2-storey unit, which has a first-floor roof terrace. The ground floor is a single-storey 2-bedroom unit, which has a rear courtyard. The buildings come right up to the street edge, and you know, our client at the time, when we won the competition, said, we need front gardens, defensible space was what people talked about in those days. And I'm thinking, well, defense against who? You know, my neighbors. And, you know, this is the house where I lived at the time. And it seems wonderful to me what can happen when people have ownership of a space at the edge of the street and can take control of it. So this is the type, as I say. These are cottage flats, sometimes called Tyneside flats, where you go into a house there, which is a ground floor house, and up to a house there, a flat there, which is the upper flat. So they look like houses, but they're flats. Again, people say, well, what about these roof terraces? You know, isn't that going to be noisy for the neighbours? And so I took them down here. This is Pullen's building in Elephant and Castle in the south of London. This was going to be pulled down as substandard housing. Thankfully, the residents threw themselves in front of the bulldozers, and it was saved. And these roof terraces up at 2nd and 3rd floor level. And again, I was able to take people. You know, I'm a great believer in sort of. I really like it if I can find a precedent for what we're doing. I feel very reassured by precedent, and I think also it helps with you know, with clients as well. So, and the miracle was that it got built. So that's a photograph taken from a local sort of tower block. So the you know, front door into there, gateway up into the upper unit there, and a very intense relationship with the street. So these oriel windows kind of almost become like display cabinets for the people who live in them, but also Jane Jacobs would have liked them because you can kind of look up and down the street and you can see what's happening. And the balcony off the bedroom there. And it's a project which has lots of repetition in it, so it's a grid, but there's also a sort of picturesque sensibility here. Where, you know, particular corners which present themselves in a way like this, we took extra trouble with a nice curve. I don't need to tell you about that. There's plenty of those. I've been seeing them today. Beautiful. How to do a corner. Edinburgh's an incredible sort of instruction manual, sort of turrets and oriel windows, and so I've been making little notes as I walk around. If you see that sort of thing coming out in our next project. So it's a relative, despite the fact it's only 3 stories high, it's a relatively dense project. And the secret to the density here is that when you do a normal terrace of housing, the back-to-back distance, certainly in London, has to be a minimum of 20, 25, sometimes 28 meters. So it's very land hungry. Terrace housing is very land hungry. So that one person looking out of a window there at the back of their property isn't looking at somebody looking out their window. So Donnybrook achieves quite high densities by pulling the buildings right together. And the space across here is kind of 8 meters, which is probably, there to there. So it's much, much less. The overlooking issue, which normally would have prevented us from doing this, the planners wouldn't have allowed us, it's dealt with on the ground floor by the fact there's obviously a wall separating. But the upper floors are all rotated, so each one looks into its private courtyard, as well as looking out over the street. And it's lovely. Lots of the photographs you'll see today are ones taken immediately after completion, but this is one clearly which has been taken later, and it's lovely to go back and to see how people are using these spaces. It doesn't always happen, but it's very heartwarming when it does. And what you hope and expect might happen it does happen. And as I say, a very repetitive grid, but little moments. And again, harking back to the earlier quote about how buildings kind of get life from people, I got to know the family who lived in this home. This is a second floor window. And they told me this window is a peculiar one because it's halfway up a staircase, on a landing of a staircase. But they said their little girl used to sit in there and do her homework looking out over the street, so perched in this little corner. And stories like that are what makes this job worthwhile. I mean, as I say, you can't always predict what's going to happen, and sometimes your clever idea is not such a clever idea. And we had the idea of putting a window in each front door. And, of course, nobody wants a window in their front door, not a clear glass one anyway. They want one of those things they can look through and check who's ringing on the doorbell. But what's happened, and it's a very lovely outcome, is that everybody, every time I've been there, every single person has put a little picture in their window. And yeah, that's lovely, and that's the architect's house there. Look. So the next project is a more conventional. So that's again the one I've just shown you is a kind of reworking of a pre-modern way of doing flats. This is more conventional because these are townhouses, and it's another social housing project. And I teach a day a week, and we'd come back from a trip to India, and I imported this idea of these they call them Jali walls, a perforate brick wall, as a way of celebrating the kind of street edge, but also the arches, which are kind of ubiquitous, aren't they, in India and in the UK, as a way of making a building which had a powerfully civic presence. It belongs to the street, it belongs to the city, but also each one of these gardens belongs to a person who lives there. And that articulation of the roof also emphasizes that notion of it being a terrace of houses which are about the street and about a sort of continuity, but each separate occupancy is celebrated in the architectural detail. There it is again. I mean, increasingly we work with brick. Some of the early projects are render. Sometimes those rendered projects are white render. Sometimes those rendered projects are really well looked after. Donnybrook has been. Others haven't. And so where we're working for social housing providers, people who have probably thousands of properties to look after and not very much money to do so, it feels to me now like brick is a better option. Although from an ecological perspective it has its challenges. This brings me to another social housing project in the East End of London, in Stepney this time. And these garages and storage units lie at the back of a 1950s, 1960s housing project. And our client said, we've got terrible overcrowding projects, big extended families living in 2-bedroom flats in there. Could you build 2 or 3 houses on this site? And you can use all that green and everything else like that. So when we get a new project, you're always looking for a ray of sunshine, something. It was kind of quite a forgiving, kind of not the loveliest places, but we found these gardens, these timber fences where people had started to take control of the space outside the back of their houses. So that's this side. And we came up with the idea of a timber building, so timber kind of echoing the timber of those fences and the informality of that, pushed back against the boundary and try to retain the green space in the middle to be shared by existing residents and our new people moving in. And by doing that and doing a project where they shared the garden, rather everybody having their own gardens, we gave them all roof terraces, we were able to get 7 or 8 townhouses rather than 3. So our unconventional sort of design was really unlocked the possibilities of the site. And there again, it does feel like a miracle, even though we finished this project years ago, when you go from a sketch, and that was one of the early sketches of the project I just showed you, and it comes out pretty much as you thought it might, hoped it might. So these are enormous housing. That one in the foreground there is a 7-bedroom house. And again, to go back and find this sort of thing going on, the garden sort of becoming something special is wonderful. So I think this section is a little bit about back-to-back housing. And for those who don't know, back-to-back housing, not at all common in the south of England or in London, but ubiquitous across the north of England in the industrial period, where large quantities of low-cost housing were built to house the new kind of industrial workforce moving in. This is actually a rare example in London. But what happens when you get back-to-back housing is there is no back garden. So a terrace of back-to-back houses facing that way and a terrace of back-to-back houses facing that way share a back wall. They have no back garden at all. And what happens in that situation is that people their public world is invested in the space at the front of their property, not in the back of their property. And so this is a street in South London where exactly that's happened. And you know, it's not for everybody, but for people who are quite gregarious and sociable, we'll come to that. We've done an older person's project which uses this. It's actually a really lovely way of making it possible for people to be together. So this is an older person's project. It's in Dagenham, Barking, Dagenham, the east end of London. These are existing two-bedroom cottages. This was a garage site. And we just wrapped the street in and created a row of buildings there and a row of buildings there. And the indices of incidents of loneliness amongst people in that age group, people in their 70s, 80s, 90s, who have perhaps lost a partner, who've given up work, whose families sort of left the home, is very dramatic in the stories you hear and the sort of statistics that you can see. So in this project, we made it so that this, like the photograph I've just shown you, this face at the front becomes a space in which those people can socialize and get to know one another. And there it is. That's a week after people had moved in, and you know, to see this start to happen almost immediately, and to go down there on a sunny summer's day, and all the front doors are open, and people are sitting outside, chatting to one another, and really kind of latching on to one another in a way that's absolutely beautiful. That's me having a cuppa with Pauline. And so that sort of logic, which talks about an architecture, a type of housing which is kind of suits people who are very sociable, and I think you know, a point here is that there are all sorts of people in this world, and the attempts that government makes and legislators make to try to legislate housing to suggest that there is a Mr. and Mrs. entirely normal and that everybody wants the same things from their home is such a nonsense, isn't it? Because you know, for one person living at the top of a tower block, they're sick of seeing people all day, they want to be in isolation with the view, isn't very understandable. But for other people, to be living on the street edge, to know their neighbours, to have that kind of more intense relationship, it suits them. So you know, when anybody tries to tell me what housing should be, I kind of remind them that there are so many sorts of people in this world, and that housing should reflect that in all its different forms. So this is another back-to-back housing scheme. It's in a 60s housing estate. It was an empty site. It makes a corner here. Those are two streets. It backs onto some Victorian housing here and some 80s housing here. Each one of those is a house. I'm going to have to steady my hand. Those are all houses fronting this way, and those are all houses fronting into a central courtyard. And so there you have it. You have those are 4-story houses, those are 3-story houses, and there's an archway which brings you into this courtyard and another one which brings you out here. In that house there's a kitchen on the ground floor, bedroom, and a living room, and the living room has a a little courtyard up at the top of the house. I did a talk once at the RIBA in London, and I started talking, before we built any back-to-back housing, and I was saying, I'm thinking of doing some back-to-back housing. We think it's a really interesting way of building quite sustainably, because there's not a lot of external wall to deal with, quite cheaply for the same reason. And it seems to me a type that really helps to kind of, produce a kind of sociable vibe amongst neighbours. And so, you have the Q&A, we'll have one here, but somebody stood up at the end and said, well, I grew up in back-to-back housing and it was hell. Awkward. It's really the unhappiest time of my life. And to my relief, somebody straight after stood up and said, well, I grew up in back-to-back housing and it was the happiest time of my life. And it comes back to the point that what suits one person doesn't suit another person. But it also reinforces the responsibility that comes with housing. It's quite a scary thing, because when it's done wrong and things go wrong, it's it's not going to get knocked down. It'll be there for decades and will affect the lives of generations. So I went up to Birmingham, where they've saved, the National Trust has saved 6 back-to-back houses of the 30,000 or so which the city were made of. And it was really fascinating to go and see these places, and I felt very reassured by seeing them, but also some of the people that showed us round, people my age or a little bit older, had grown up and lived in that housing which had been smashed down in the 60s for slum clearance. They'd been moved out into tower blocks on the edge of town, which have also now been knocked down, and they're all living in bungalows in the, and it's just like a whole world that they shared has been sort of destroyed by the destruction of these places. So we thought it was worth trying, and so there we have the ground floor plan. That's a kitchen facing that way, that's a kitchen facing that way, no back gardens. And there it is on the day of completion, and we're very interested in the relationship between the interior of the home and the street. And you get in, like in America, you get the stoop, don't you, and the porch at the front of the houses. You've seen it in the films, the lady with the pipe and the shotgun sitting on when somebody's playing a guitar. So we can't do the raised stoop because of we need to have level access for people with mobility issues. But I thought it was interesting to try to create a space at the front of the home which would serve that function to some extent. And so we did that. There's the central courtyard. It's looking much more green now. I need to go back and photograph it. And we have contact with the people who live here, who are very really loving it. There's the kitchen on the ground floor, and there's the top floor living room. So you can be on the street edge, or you can be rather secluded up above with your, as I say, your roof terrace up above. And again, to go back, I posted this thing on Instagram, this photograph, and the lady who lives there sent me a really nice message saying, this house has transformed our lives. My kids love cycling around in the courtyard. I know that they're fine and they're safe, and you can see that they're enjoying it. And again there, not everyone is doing stuff, but lots of them are, and that's again a lovely thing to kind of see. Right, so Richard was talking about our project on a motorway. We get lots of rubbish sites, but this really took the biscuit. So that there, around there, oh shit, sorry. That there, around there is the motorway. We won this in competition, and all the other projects, it's a very difficult site, had 3 or 4 apartment buildings along this long site. And our approach, and they managed to get 50 or so homes. We got 100 homes with a project where the architectural strategy really unlocked the site, and the strategy was to build a wall building against the motorway, thin enough so that it's 1 room deep. So every room in this wall building can have a window opening into what is here, which is a little muse street, where you could literally hear a pin drop. You would never know that the traffic was thundering past on the other side of the road. And there is that terrace of they're effectively tenement blocks where they're kind of walk-ups. Each one's a little tenement with one flat per floor, and then a row of houses on this side. And again, that's a sketch done virtually on day one. It's not that I'm inflexible or anything. How about that? So, and if it had been that easy, that would have been good. And so there was repetition again in here, but a recognition that this corner is rather special, and there's an apartment building with a little lift in it, and 2 flats per floor. And we're making something of the entrance into the Mews, but also something that you see as you drive down the main road. So it's an interesting project because the identity of this side of the project, very kind of quite muscular, quite heroic, quite sort of bold, quite solid, gives way on the other side to this space which feels much more domestic. It's softer. It's softened by the greenery, but also by the stepping of the architecture in these terraces. And again, I look forward to kind of revisiting each summer to see how what started to happen, and this is a few months in, will hopefully kind of gather pace, and people will really start to take control of the space that we've created for them here. Incidentally, it was a requirement of planning that we had car parking, but there was a steep slope across the site, and so there was actually a car park underneath here. And a bit of a show-homey interior, but a bit more of a lived-in one. So this is one of the homes which is right down next to the main road. And the guy here he's a professional harpsichordist, so if it works for him, you know. But again, so that's their outlook over the main road. But behind the photographer here is a view out into their little ground floor courtyard. So as our buildings get bigger, we try to stick to our guns. So the importance of the street, active frontages on the street, front doors at regular intervals along the street. I mean, the modernist apartment building often had a single point of access, and very often the city really wasn't greatly of interest to some of these people, or certainly the street wasn't. But when we do our apartment buildings, our bigger apartment buildings, we're saying it remains really important how it relates to the street. So each of these ground floor units is actually a maisonette, like a little house, with its own way in through a gate into each separate unit. One of these gates leads into a staircase and lift, which brings you up into the main part of the project. So even when we get bigger with our projects, we still attach a great deal of interest to the street. And we're also after a degree of visual complexity. Again, when they get bigger, projects can often get kind of, oh, we can't sort of muck about with this too much, let's keep it simple. Well, we try to keep it complicated. At the back of the project is a whole bunch of houses, like little courtyard houses. This is for a private developer, but it provided, I think, 50% social housing. And we were able to do that because it's built relatively inexpensively in brick. And we've, over many years, kind of developed a way of detailing our buildings quite efficiently. But it's also a very efficient use of the site. It's quite high density. And that makes it possible to provide a greater amount of social housing. Some quite sort of tasty interiors. Some quite long balconies. And again, going back and finding this sort of thing going on. So we're into kind of homeless stuff here. And this is a project in North London. And we were invited by Camden Council to do this scheme. It's a homeless hostel. And they said, well, we're not really bothered about you knocking this building down. If it helps, knock it down. And I thought that would have been a shame. And surely here's a wonderful example of the joy that can be taken in breathing new life into an old building and giving it kind of another 100 years or more. And so, it's not an exceptional piece of architecture, but I thought the local people were quite fond of it, and it seemed to me that it was worth looking after. But it's a very deep site, and that is the building fronting the street, and there was all of this stuff out the back, some of it single story. And we said maybe there's another way of thinking about the site and us getting more out of it. And the existing building, that sort of spine building, had these long, dark corridors, which are very, very common in homeless hostels. and are really enough to do your head in. But if you've got mental health problems and you've been living in a cardboard box for a while and your parents have kicked you out of home, you've lost your social housing, you haven't been able to pay your rent, that is not an ideal environment. But that might be. And we invited Camden, who at that time had a very, very forward-thinking head of kind of looking after homeless people. And it's a council, a left-wing council, or parts of it are, which take their responsibilities to the weakest people in our society very seriously. So I showed them that image, and they responded very warmly to it. I mean, it's not just the fact that a corridor like that is pretty freaky for people who live there, but it's not very nice for people who work in these places. They're often very windy corridors. You're never quite sure what you're going to find around the corner. And it does seem to me that a garden is a way of circulating within a building like that, which is, after all, lots and lots of rooms, is a really good starting point. So this is the plan that we came up with the project. That's the existing building, which we remodeled extensively. But we said to them, what about little tiny almshouses? The previous image was some, I think, Dutch almshouses. So each person, rather than the people living in clusters, sharing fridges and fights breaking out, people get the sort of dignity that comes with living in their own tiny house. Tiny it is, it's temporary accommodation. Each one of those is a house you could virtually touch the walls of either side of it. But this is as opposed to living in either a dormitory or living in a tiny ensuite, or even sometimes not an ensuite. It's a brilliant funding stream that came from the then Labour government, which was about trying to improve people's life chances who live in homeless hostels. It wasn't just about getting people off the street. It's about working with them to help train them about looking after themselves, looking after their medical conditions, their addiction problems, their mental health issues, and trying to teach them practical skills about cooking for themselves, shopping. And so, and very often, this is the entrance area of a hostel. Very often, the entrance area to a hostel is all about kind of protecting the staff. You know, you go in, there's a little hatch. What do you want? I need a room. Okay, come in. And it's a kind of airlock situation. Well, the new hostels, and I was talking to somebody earlier on who was talking about this very same thing, are much more open. They feel much more like, well, it's like going into a lovely hotel. So this on the left-hand side is a reception desk. There's a sofa over here. If things get tricky here, well, come, let's sit over there and chat about it. Through there, you can see some counselling spaces and spaces where kind of training goes on. Through there, there's a courtyard garden. And so it's not just about the building, it's about the programs that are run within them, the amazing work that people are able to do, and the way that the architecture can assist them in achieving that. So here's our project, the existing building left-hand end, the courtyard garden. And so we said to, and this is a drawing I did when we went to see the council. And I read to them what I'm about to read to you now, and so I said this: we imagine a group of residents working with a gardener to create and maintain an intensely planted and beautiful garden, an apple tree or two, potatoes, green veg, soft fruit, herbs, a greenhouse, a potting shed, and a sunny spot to sit and rest. We think there ought to be a little shed in the garden, a room or shed in the garden. That's that thing there, up in the middle there, for private chats, one-to-one, and counselling. Conceived as the social heart of the hostel, the garden creates a homely, domestic atmosphere. It gives participating residents an interest and an outlet for their energy, helping to foster a sense of belonging, self-worth, and empowerment. So this was our idea for the project, and Camden bought into it. This was the place when it was completed during COVID. I haven't got photographs of that, but this is another of the hostels where a garden has been created. We've been, as a practice, involved in helping with that garden, both in funding it, but also working with residents there. And to see the effect that a space like this can have on people, many of them with quite severe difficulties. I remember one guy being brought down who was just in the middle of the most depressive episode, and he was brought down by his mates, And they more or less held his hands while he planted a plant there, and just a very tender and lovely moment, and made possible because Camden were supportive of the idea of a garden, because we suggested it, and you know, it just shows what architecture can do when you sort of encountered it at first hand. So back at Holmes Road, this is one of the little units that we designed. As I say, you can virtually touch the walls of it. There's a tiny kitchenette, there's a shower room. You walk in through this door here, it's a stable door, a shower room underneath there, then you walk upstairs and onto a bedroom which is underneath this kind of vaulted roof. Again, we work with models to just reassure ourselves that it's quite sort of compact. Place is working for us. There's a view from one of the homes into the garden. Oh, what's happened there? So some snaps of things we're working on at the moment. This is, again, a bigger version of our sort of stepped ziggurat apartment building. Again, a great deal of emphasis on the street. This is on Edgware Road, which is one of the main roads into our city. And so it has a kind of pretty sort of imposing kind of civic frontage, but it's in a kind of suburban area, so it steps down very suddenly to meet the kind of smaller suburban environment in which it's set. This is in Shropshire. It's at the Flax Mill in Shropshire. It's a beautiful Grade 1 historic building where we're designing a little village of little streets and muses and front doors along streets around the existing building, and we hope that's with Historic England. This is we're doing a project in Guernsey. Could be in Scotland, couldn't it? But it's actually in Guernsey, which is an island that's basically made of granite. And so we very much hope that we can experiment with new materials, with stone and brick coins, and that's a kind of sketch that I did the other day. And it kind of brings things a little bit more up to date with you, and another little housing project we're doing in South London. This is in Germany, where we're trying to do a project which is timber shingles, a bit like the timber shingles we used on the Stepney project, where they have very large butterflies. Got a bit carried away there. Right. Okay, so this is the last part of the talk. How are we doing? Are we? Is it okay? So this is a bit about dreams, really. And as I said, when you work in are you all architects? Hands up, who's an architect? Oh my God, okay. Well, it's quite challenging at times, isn't it? And I do think that we should have a space to dream. And my space to dream is in my sketchbooks and in my sort of idle moments. And I did this project called 1 Year, 365 Cities, in which I attempted to design. My mate said you can design a city in 10 minutes, which is kind of an arrogant thing to say, but. And I tried to design a city a day. I had a train journey, so I tried to spend 10 minutes of that train journey designing a city a day for a year, and I actually failed. I got it about 150, and then it got a bit dull. But so these are some of the sketches out of my sketchbooks for this. There's mud ones, there's stone ones. There's one made out of mushroom spores. There's you know, so all sorts of things. I haven't got time to go into them, but here are some sketches. And this is a space, so I also teach a day a week, which is another space for dreaming. And lots of academic institutions say we get architects in so that we have a bit of common sense coming into our rather arty, flighty kind of. I think it's the other way around. I think people talk common sense in academia, and what's going on out here, where there are hundreds of thousands of homeless people, that's insanity. So I go into college to dream a little bit about how things might be better. You know, if we could think of another way of organising our economy and challenge some of the assumptions and preconceptions that people have about how we organise things. So that's, in a sense, these drawings and sketches and sometimes models are kind of annexed to that kind of mindset. And sometimes my 10-minute town I get a bit more carried away, and we start making ceramic models. And this is an idea for a mud village in Wiltshire. And this was an idea which we called 100-mile city. It was the idea that the circumference of London is 100 miles long. If we're going to build a ton more housing in London, would this not be the place to do it? Not spreading out in suburbia, but taking the last 100 metres or so, not spreading out into the green belt, but taking the last 100 metres of suburbia to create a city surrounding London, and a proper city, not a suburban one with schools and infrastructure and a transport system and so on. And again, one got a little carried away. Very carried away. So this is the last little bit, okay? And if you think 100-mile city is a sort of a bit, well, this one's called 8,000-mile island. And it just, I started thinking, where I started this lecture, about all these hundreds of thousands of empty homes, and started to think about the investment of, most of our resources in the southeast of England, and most of that in London, and thinking that isn't where the money is needed. The money is needed in other parts of these islands, and in thinking about it, I started to reflect on the fact that some of the most challenged areas of our island are in the coastal cities, which hitherto have been centres of production for the fishing industry, for shipbuilding, for steelworks, and I started thinking about the coastline, and it's this is absolutely unique for our country. It's 8,000-mile long coastline. Nobody lives any more than, is it 100 miles from the sea here? We have the most powerful tides in the world, apart from the east coast of Canada. The most powerful tides in the world, off the west coast of Wales. I think it's like 5 stories between high and low tide out at sea. So this is a really powerful idea in the sense of the potential for us generating. We have the strongest winds in Europe. So I started to think about these quite big issues and how they all might be interrelated in some way. And the fact that we import half of our energy from overseas. Well, if we've got all this potential to create our energy, why are we buying gas from Russia, and why are we buying oil from tin pot dictators in the Middle East when we could just be doing it ourselves with green energy? And by doing it ourselves, I don't mean flogging off the rights to private companies from Spain to come and do this. I mean do it ourselves with a nationalized kind of industry. The other thing is that we import half of our food from overseas. We always pretty much always have. Half of our food comes from overseas, half of that comes from beyond Europe. So food miles, our part in the sort of very destructive global agricultural kind of system, which kind of sweeps through states all over the world, screwing up their economies and trashing rainforests. So might this idea of bringing renewed prosperity to the coastal regions of our country, investing public money into basically an agricultural industrial revolution. So I'm going to just close by reading you a bit of what I said about that. Picture this. Build 100 400 megawatt offshore wind farms and range them around our shores. Interlace them with thousands of floating tidal energy turbines out at sea. Construct enormous tidal lagoons in our estuaries. Put miniature community-run cottage industry wave power machines and little barrages on rocky outcrops and inlets on our shoreline in Cornwall, the Hebrides and Cumbria. Let's intersperse these offshore energy industries with enormous seaweed farms. These are already under construction off the coast of Norfolk, North Yorkshire and in the southwest. Seaweed carbon sinks, Amazonian in their scale. Not only do they produce loads of stuff, they're also brilliant for the environment by being carbon sinks. Producing food, a source of energy, and munching carbon as they go. Give us hundreds of deep-sea coastal oyster beds, mussel farms, fish and lobster hatcheries, floating fish farms in the deep-sea ocean. I'm going to flick through some slides now. This is an amazing tide machine that's being developed in this country. I mean, as I understand it, one of the leading maritime research centres for maritime energy is in the Orkneys here. You perhaps know about it, but I think they're testing these here with great success. A barrage which was envisaged on the Severn estuary back in the 40s, I think. Let's intersperse these offshore energy industries with enormous seaweed farms, blah, blah, blah. Give us hundreds of deep-sea coastal oyster beds, mussel farms, fish and lobster hatcheries, floating fish farms in the deep ocean producing hundreds of thousands of tons of food and millions of gallons of fish shit fertilizer to supply to aquaponic farms. Construct maritime research stations in a necklace around these islands. Link them to our coastal universities, adding to and sharing knowledge of these nascent technologies and processes for the benefit of everyone. Imagine existing fishing fleets, their local knowledge, their know-how and equipment co-opted into these burgeoning industries. Employ the infrastructure already existing in the UK's declining offshore oil and shipbuilding industries, in Hull, Inverness and on the Clyde, and think of thousands of new shops in tired old Blackpool, Margate, St Leonard's, Southend-on-Sea and Newhaven. Think of the housing industry redeployed away from the southeast and charged with saving and restoring hundreds of thousands of empty homes, whole streets and neighbourhoods currently abandoned, in decay, now buzzing with new life. That's a deep sea fish farm in Norway. That's one of those amazing wave machines, the tide machines. Imagine whole streets and neighbourhoods, neighbourhoods currently abandoned, in decay, now buzzing with new life, activity and prosperity from the incoming workforce. Let's think carefully about how these nationalised industries might make the best of top-down strategic planning, organisation and funding by central government, combined with devolved management, bottom-up, employing local knowledge, practically, usefully and efficiently applied. And let's also think about how the profits from these processes and nationally owned industries might, as they have in Norway, be reinvested into a sovereign wealth fund for the benefit of each and every citizen in our country. Thank you.
It now gives me great pleasure on behalf of the Royal Scottish Academy to present you with a very fine gold medal to celebrate your Metzstein Discourse lecture in 2025. It's a very splendid thing. So here it is.
Wow, look at that.
A beautiful gold medal. I think I'm right in saying it was made in Scotland. It's a Scottish piece of goldsmithery, and perhaps you could show it to the audience.